Do you know who Elizabeth Duke is? How about Donald Cohn or Kevin Warsh? No? Because you should. Because while Congress was debating back in 2008 whether or not to bail out the banksters with a $700 billion blank check, these guys and girls were just doing it. They were funneling $7.7 trillion to Wall Street under the table without one constituent phone call, without worrying about one election, without having to give one explanation. They were able to do this, these three were able to pull this off because they're members of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, a group of people who are not voted into office but have the power to completely dictate monetary policy in the United States. They are not politicians. They're technocrats. They're bankers and financial experts. Technocrats aren't interested generally in democracy. It's not what they do. It takes too long. Often the interests of the majority of the voters don't quite line up with the interests of the majority of the bankers and foreign investors. Or to put it in today's terms, the interests of the 99% rarely line up with the interests of the 1%. That's why back in 2008, the technocrats at the Fed weren't interested in waiting for Congress, with all of its open debate and constituent services, to bail out the banks. They just went ahead and did it themselves. According to documents obtained by Bloomberg News in 2009, the Fed dished out $7.7 trillion in no strings attached, super low interest loans to Wall Street's biggest players. That's $7.7 trillion. The entire GDP of our nation is $15 trillion. That's more than half of the total value of everything, every single thing produced in America that same year. $7.7 trillion went out the door to those banksters with nobody bothering to inform you or me, the voters, the electorate, anybody about it until now. And since they were super low interest loans, when the bank rolled that money over, they made enormous profits off them. 6 of our nation's biggest banks, like Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, pocketed a not too shabby $13 billion in profits that up until now were undisclosed, thanks to this deal that they made with the technocrats at the Fed. So today, thanks to a decision made by technocrats and not politicians, the too big to fail banks are even bigger, and Wall Street has raked in more profit in just the last 30 months than they did in the entire 8 years leading up to the 2008 financial crisis. And they weren't doing too shabby then. I guess the economic crisis that brought banksters to the ledge ended up being very lucrative for them in the long run. But the bigger picture for this is, can our democracy survive future financial crises? As the world descends into financial turmoil on fears that the Eurozone may collapse, it's the technocrats who are taking power. They're replacing elected officials. The clearest example of this is what happened in Greece a few weeks ago. In order to preserve the euro, keep financial markets steady, and ensure that foreign investors have what's theirs, the technocrats at the IMF and the European Central Bank demanded that Greece take a bailout. Knowing that a bailout would mean more layoffs, higher taxes, and less benefits for the Greek people, Greek Prime Minister George Papandreou wanted to hold a national referendum, national vote, on whether or not to take that bailout, just like Iceland had done a year earlier. He wanted the people of Greece, through democracy, to determine their own fate. Never happened. Just floating the idea cost Papandreou his job. He was forced out of office and replaced by a technocrat, Lucas Papademos, who just so happened to be the former vice president of the European Central Bank. Probably because when the Icelandic people were asked in a national referendum if they should take austerity cuts to bail out their banksters, they said overwhelmingly, hell no, let the banks fail. So with a technocrat in charge in Greece, there will be no vote. A bailout will be shoved down the throat of the Greek people, and so too will painful austerity. Anything to keep the banksters happy. New York Times op-ed columnist Russ Douthat laid out this new reality of technocrat control in a recent article in which he wrote, "For the inhabitants of Italy and Greece, who have just watched democratically elected governments topple by pressure from financiers, European Union bureaucrats, and foreign heads of state, it evokes the cold reality of 21st century politics. Democracy may be nice in theory, but in a time of crisis, it's the technocrats who get to call the shots. National sovereignty is a pretty concept, but the survival of the European common currency comes first. All signs indicate that we'll be confronted with this problem once again in the United States, as another financial crisis, be it caused by Europe or some other bubble like student debt or housing, seems like a foregone conclusion at this point. And when it hits the fan, and the American people tell Congress, no way in hell will they sign off on another bailout of Wall Street, then expect the technocrats at the Fed to take over again. And our democracy will be irrelevant, just like it was in 2008 and 2009. That's why we, the people, need to take back control of the Fed, and why the people of Europe need to take back control of their central banks and global financial institutions. Only when the Federal Reserve becomes an instrument of the people to calm the mood swings of the market, and not a piggy bank for transnational banking corporations, can we really protect ourselves from a technocratic takeover in the future. And the way to do that's pretty straightforward. It was Alexander Hamilton's idea back in the George Washington administration. Have the central bank owned by the U.S. government and run by the Treasury Department. So all the profits from banking go directly into the Treasury. Thus, you and I pay less in taxes, and the banksters on Wall Street can get a job at Walmart. The good people in North Dakota did just that back in 1919. They established something very much like this, the Bank of North Dakota. And it's kept that state in the black and kept its farmers, manufacturers, and students protected from the predations of New York banksters for nearly a century. It's time for every state to charter their own state bank, just like North Dakota did, and for the Treasury Department to either buy the Fed from the for-profit banks that own it or simply nationalize it. Only when we get control of our money out of the hands of sociopathic banksters will our democracy begin to function for all the people instead of just for the banksters.